The night was young, and the party buzzed with life, laughter, and music. The kind of chaotic energy that only seemed to exist at gatherings like this, where too much alcohol flowed. And old rivalries lay beneath every conversation. The house, a sprawling residence tucked into a quiet, upscale neighborhood, belonged to him, my college rival. Just stepping through the door was a test of pride. I didn't want to be there. Didn't want to breathe the same air as him. Yet here I was, pulled by the promise of seeing old friends and by something else, a gnawing curiosity, a challenge I couldn't resist. I brought my girlfriend along, her hand resting in mine as we walked in. She looked stunning, as always, her dress hugging her curves in all the right ways, her hair cascading down her shoulders like a dark river. She smiled nervously as we were greeted by a flurry of faces. Some familiar, some less so. I squeezed her hand and she glanced at me. The flicker of anxiety in her eyes, a reminder of why I'd brought her here. She didn't know my full reasoning, of course. On the surface, I wanted to show her off, to let her charm my friends, and remind them that I had won something greater than any petty rivalry. But deep down, there was a darker truth. I wanted to test her, to push her boundaries, to see how far she'd go when thrown into a room full of admirers. There was something intoxicating about the idea of it, a cocktail of control and voyeuristic thrill. I wanted to see her through their eyes, wanted to watch their gazes linger, their compliments grow bolder, knowing she was mine and mine alone. The very thought set my pulse racing in a way I couldn't explain. Even to myself, the night began innocently enough. We drifted through the crowd, exchanging greetings and pleasantries. I introduced her to a few people, watching as they responded to her with warm smiles and appreciative glances. She was polite, reserved, and the picture of grace. But when I encouraged her to mingle on her own, she hesitated, her fingers brushing mine as if to ask for reassurance. "Go on," I murmured, my voice low and steady. "Have fun, meet people." She gave me a small, uncertain smile and stepped away, her movements careful, deliberate. My eyes followed her as she wove through the crowd, her presence drawing attention like a magnet. Men turned to look at her, their conversations faltering as she passed. I could see the way they appraised her, their gazes lingering on the curve of her hips, the line of her neck. It was exactly what I wanted, yet it filled me with a tension I couldn't quite name, a mixture of pride, jealousy, and something darker. And then there he was, the host. He had that same easy confidence I'd always hated, the kind that came naturally to men who'd never had to try too hard for anything. His suit was sharp, his smile sharper, and the way he carried himself made it clear he still thought of himself as the king of the room. My gut twisted as I watched him approach her, his expression lighting up with that effortless charm he wielded like a weapon. At first it was just small talk. I told myself it was nothing, that she was only being polite. But as the minutes ticked by, their body language shifted. She leaned closer, her laughter soft and warm, the kind of laugh that used to be reserved for me. His hand touched her arm lightly as he spoke, and she didn't pull away. My chest tightened, my grip on my drink turning knuckles white. Every fiber of my being told me to intervene, but I held back, rooted by a perverse curiosity. What would she do if I let her continue? How far would she go? The drinks flowed and her hesitation began to fade. She stumbled slightly, and he caught her with a hand around her waist, steadying her. She laughed again, leaning into him, and I could see the way his gaze flickered to her lips, her neckline. My heart pounded as I watched him guide her closer, his touch lingering a moment longer than necessary. And then it happened. A fleeting kiss, barely more than a brush of lips, but enough to make my stomach churn. Before I could react, he took her hand and led her upstairs. My mind reeled as I watched them disappear into his room, the door closing softly behind them. I was frozen, my thoughts spiraling into chaos. Were they doing it now? Was she resisting? Or was she giving in? Did she even think of me as he undressed her? Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. When they finally returned, they slipped back into the crowd as if nothing had happened. She looked flustered, her hair slightly mussed. Her dress creased in places it hadn't been before. Her eyes darted around the room, avoiding mine until I stepped into her line of sight. When our gazes met, the guilt hit her like a thunderclap. She tried to compose herself, smoothing her dress, brushing back her hair, but it was futile. I already knew. The ride home was silent. She sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes downcast. The tension in the car was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words. When we finally reached our apartment, I couldn't hold back any longer. "What the hell were you thinking?" My voice was cold, sharp as a blade. She flinched, tears welling in her eyes as she tried to explain, to apologize. But I cut her off. "Do you think he can give you what I can't? Do you think he knows you like I do?" Her tears spilled over, her voice cracking as she pleaded with me. "Sorry," she whispered, her words trembling with desperation. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I didn't know what I was doing." "Show me," I said, my voice low, commanding. Her eyes widened, confusion mingling with fear. "Show me exactly what you did with him." She hesitated, the shame evident in her expression, but I didn't back down. Slowly, reluctantly, she moved closer, her hands trembling as they touched me. Her actions were hesitant, filled with a frantic need to prove herself, to earn my forgiveness. As she moved, I watched her closely, my emotions a turbulent mix of anger, desire, and control. Her vulnerability was raw, her tears mingling with her whispered apologies. And I reveled in it, but as the moment stretched, a pang of guilt crept in. How far could I push her before it became too much? How much of this was about punishment? And how much was about my own twisted need to control her? When it was over, she lay against me, her body trembling with exhaustion. Her tears had dried, but her eyes were still puffy, her expression a mix of relief and sorrow. I held her close, stroking her hair as she murmured her thanks. Her voice barely audible. She was mine again, fully and completely. Despite the chaos of the night, I felt a grim satisfaction. She drifted into a fitful sleep, her breath soft against my chest. I stared into the darkness, my thoughts tangled and restless. Tonight, Eid pushed boundaries, hers and mine. I told myself it was worth it, that we'd both found what we needed. But as the hours ticked by, the questions returned, gnawing at the edges of my mind. What had really happened in that room? And what did it say about me that I let it play out the way I had? In the stillness of the night, the answers didn't come. But for now, she was in my arms, and that would have to be enough.